Today we will be discussing sorcery. The book of Revelation speaks about many evils in the world during the last days. Most of these we know and recognize, but there may be one that we don't understand. Take, for example, Revelations 21 verse 8, where John the Revelator describes those that end up in the telestial kingdom. He says, quote, "But the fearful and unbelieving, and the abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idlers, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." I think most of us have a good idea of what each of those terms are describing except one: sorcerers. While sorcery is discussed throughout all Scripture, it can mean something different to us today than it did anciently. Today, sorcery brings images formed from pop culture references such as Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and countless other movies and books where magic exists and is used, but from a scriptural perspective, it isn't quite the same. This slide lists, I think, every verse that mentions sorcery. As you can see, there aren't a ton of them, which allows us to analyze them in great detail. In fact, we are going to focus on the Old and New Testament verses which allow us to look at the original language and their meaning. But so you stick with me here until the end, we are going to find that in the book of Revelation, sorcery in the last days is not what most people think, and we are seeing it throughout the world today. But let's understand the basics first. It gets confusing because if you go to sorcery in the topical guide, you see that it lists a bunch of scriptures that don't say sorcery, but other correct interpretations of the original Hebrew and Greek, including the term false prophets, magicians, superstitions, familiar spirits, enchanters, divination, soothsayers, astrologers, and others. Unfortunately, this isn't the whole story here. It gets more confusing if you go to the Bible dictionary, which has a singular definition of a sorcerer as one who foretells events by casting lots. While that is true, it also isn't the whole story. The root words in Hebrew and Greek certainly can mean those things, but these are words that highly depend upon the context of the verse, which means it is up to the interpretation of the translator. And as we know, sometimes they were spot on and sometimes they missed the mark. With something like the term sorcery, its translation may be meaningfully different, as you will see in a moment. For example, in Genesis 41 verse 8, when Pharaoh calls the magicians to his court to interpret his dream, the original Hebrew word for magician is this. Strong Concordance has it assigned the number 2748 and means an engraver or writer. Now that isn't what we normally think about when we hear magician, but when we dig deeper, we learn that these engravers or writers were used as diviners to seek signs in the stars to gain occult knowledge. Okay, now the term magician makes a little bit more sense. Now you can see how the context matters. Exodus 7 verse 11 is the first time the word sorcerer is used in the Bible, but in this context means nearly the same as in Genesis and other places. Although in this context something is added. A sorcerer uses spells and witchcraft to assist in their divination and other works. In Micah 5:12, the word is translated witchcraft, and yet keshpesh, Strong Concordance 3785, means sorcery. So you see, all of these words are related in many ways with subtle differences. It is one of those differences that is important to this gospel lesson. Going back to the verses specifically translated sorcery, over 25% of them are in the book of Revelation and talking about our day. One could also argue that the Book of Mormon, being a type and shadow of our day, could also be put in that category, as well as the references in the Doctrine and Covenants. Also, the verse in Malachi is speaking of the last days specifically, so most of the verses that use the term sorcery are speaking of the last days. Let's look at Revelation 9:21. The word sorceries comes from the Greek word pharmakos, Strong Concordance number 5333. The definition is a poisoner, sorcerer, or magician, but additional depth shows that the word origin means a drug, the context meaning that a sorcerer is one that uses drugs. In fact, this term broadly can mean medicine, drugs, or poison. I'm sure most of you already put it together that this is the origin of the English word pharmaceuticals. Now, perhaps the verse makes more sense to a modern reader. Quote, "Neither repented they of their murders, nor of their drug use, nor of their fornications, nor of their thefts." Revelation 21 verse 8 uses the same Greek word as does Revelation 22:15, which also now makes more sense. Revelation 18:23 has a similar word, pharmakia, which means drug-related sorcery. It comes from the original word pharmakuo, which means to administer drugs, specifically meaning the use or the administration of drugs. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 5, verses 19 and 20 refers to witchcraft. However, the original Greek word is pharmakia, again meaning to use or administer drugs. So that list of things like magic, witchcraft, astrology, divination, and such all were done with and through the use of drugs. In other words, the common element between all of them is the use of drugs. For example, the term familiar spirits is associated with speaking with the dead. The person performing this would often rely on the help of drugs, whether that be to allow the spirit to possess their body temporarily or to be a medium to communicate through. But the root word seems to indicate direct drug use as part of these actions. It may be why drug use can be linked to greater influence from evil spirits. With this added understanding of sorcery, verses in the Book of Mormon may come to have more meaning for our day. Quote, "For those who did not belong to the church did indulge themselves in sorceries, and in idolatry and idleness, and in the babblings, and in envyings and strife, wearing costly apparel, being lifted up in the pride of their own eyes, persecuting, lying, thieving, robbing, committing whoredoms, and murdering, and all manner of wickedness. Nevertheless, the law was put in force upon all those who did transgress it, inasmuch as it was possible." Sounds like our day, doesn't it? Likewise, Mormon is seeing the beginning of the end of the Nephite nation as he records Mormon 1:19, quote, "And it came to pass that there were sorceries and witchcrafts and magics, and the power of the evil one was wrought upon the face of the land, even unto the fulfilling of all the words of Abinadi, and also Samuel the Lamanite." But anciently, both in the Old and New Testaments, it appears that these sorcerers were using the drugs for a few different purposes. According to Thayer's Greek lexicon for pharmakia, it says that there are three primary uses of sorcery. The first is the use and administering of drugs. Second, for poisoning. Lastly, magical arts for the use of deceptions and seductions. So with an understanding that drugs will be used for deceptions and seductions, I'd like to go back to some of those verses in Revelation and talk about sorcery. Revelation 18:23 says, quote, "And the light of the candle shall shine no more at all in thee, and the voice of the bridegroom and of the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee. For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all nations deceived. And in her was found the blood of the prophets, and of saints, and of all that were slain upon the earth." Now, context is important here. John is saying this after the saints have been called back to Missouri, after there have been great calamities, wars, and many saints have been persecuted and killed. The wicked have been destroyed and countless people slain. And then John comments on the plan that brought all of this about. Quote, "By thy sorceries were all nations deceived." It would appear from these verses that there will be a time in the latter days when evil and conspiring men use pharmaceuticals to deceive the nations. It may be that it starts out as medicine. Then pharmaceuticals will play a part in deceiving and seducing the world. Now, I'm sure that some believe that this could be the vaccines for the pandemics and plagues, while others might believe that we're talking about the viruses and the plagues and the pandemics are the pharmaceutical weapons themselves. Maybe one or the other is right, maybe neither or both is right. We shouldn't draw firm conclusions about the outcome of things as much as what John is trying to do with warning us about the root cause of what we need to do to stay away from them. Because the outcome is clearly written by John, in Revelation 9:20 and 21, it says about these people, "And the rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues, yet repented not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship devils, and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and of wood, which neither can see, nor hear, nor walk. Neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts." And then John describes the fate and final destination of these people in Revelation 21, verse 9, quote, But the fearful and unbelieving, and the abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death, meaning they will inherit the lowest of the kingdoms of glory, even the celestial kingdom. Revelation 13 seems to be describing these same individuals in similar circumstances, except in these verses it is describing the mark of the beast. I always find it interesting when similar wording is used throughout the scriptures. In verse 14 it talks about the world being deceived. Could the mark of the beast be tied to the sorcery and the pharmaceuticals? False Christs are listed as one of the similar topics to sorcery, which makes sense when you read Matthew 24, verse 24. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible they shall deceive the very elect. It will be these false Christs that shall deceive, and it appears it is in conjunction with the use of pharmaceuticals in the last days. These false Christs are the ones that deceive the very elect. And as it says in Revelation 19, verse 20, it is them that bring about the mark of the beast. The Lord has given us a coat of health, which we call the word of wisdom, which has some elements that are often overlooked by members of the church. Verse 2 makes it clear that this is for the temporal salvation of all saints in the last days, to keep us alive during difficult end times. Verse 4 says we need this, quote, in consequence of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days. Then at the end, the Lord gives us the promises of health that will attend us if we obey. But the greatest promise is in the final verse, verse 21, that the destroying angels shall pass by them as the children of Israel and not slay them. The promise mirrors that of the plagues of Egypt. I did an entire video on that subject which goes into much more depth. Here's the link if you're interested. 2 Nephi chapter 28 verses 6 through 21 tells us exactly what is going to happen in the last days and what we need to do. Then the Lord lays out a pattern that we need to follow specifically in Doctrine and Covenants 52 verse 14 to protect ourselves from this. There is a lot in those verses, so I'm not going to cover them here, but I would highly encourage you to read them. Drugs seem to be Satan's secret weapon in the last days. Drug use that perhaps begins as medicine and later becomes commonly used for recreational purposes may lead to greater acceptance of drugs and their use in society. And at some point now or in the future, according to Scripture at least, evil and conspiring men will use pharmaceuticals in some way to deceive and kill a great many people here on the earth. Gordon B. Hinckley once said, quote, broken bones will mend and will function again in a normal way, but a mind warped by drugs or a body weakened or distorted by these evil things will not be easily repaired. I don't know if you ever heard him say that quote or not, but isn't it amazing that you can hear his voice in your head saying it? That is what the scriptures are talking about when they speak of sorcery. Also, this is all my opinion as always. And be careful not to draw biased conclusions. People may try to use this information to support their views on vaccinations or anti-vaxxing, or perhaps to draw conclusions about sources of pandemics and viruses. This video is not meant for any of that. Try not to use it for finger-pointing, blame, evidence, or justification. I didn't create this video to be political, but rather to create awareness of a term that I believe is often misunderstood, which we need to better understand as we travel through these last days. Thanks for watching.